Hello and welcome back. I'm Stephen Russell. We are discussing the issue of who you are, and this is part 2. Some of you listening to me may very well have members of your family who would self-identify as transgender, or possibly even you have friends, or perhaps you even found yourself to identify as transgender. 3 things are important for you to know today as I speak with you. First of all, God loves you. Secondly, God cares about you. I don't care where you are or who you're from. God created humanity out of love for relationship and not out of curiosity to see what this little creature would be like. Thirdly, the reason I'm talking to you about this subject is because we as a community love all people and want to help and stand with and encourage no matter where you are and who you are. This series also is in recognition, of course, of Dr. James White's blogs and material that have proven invaluable on the subject. Thank you, Dr. White. Members of the trans community don't often hear what I've just said, much less feel it. And for that, I truly am sorry and wish that it would be different for you in your case. If you're a believer and you're confused about the whole transgender issue, perhaps this series will give you some practical, common sense information to make the right kinds of decisions towards yourself and others around you. Now, according to a study, more than 6,000 trans adults, 57% have family members who refuse to speak to them. 50% of these transgender folk have experienced harassment at school. 65% have suffered physical or sexual violence. And listen to this, a full 69%, that's almost 70%, have experienced homelessness. They were rejected and thrown out. What a tragic set of events that is. In my understanding, there is no justice or reason for those to experience that kind of damage and alienation that shows hatred and disrespect. And I believe it grieves the very heart of God when we stand up as the church and lambaste and criticize and pull down and laugh at. I've actually heard that, believe it or not, ministers get up and laugh about the subject in a very disparaging manner. In speaking the truth in love, we are going to be as faithful as possible to what I believe is transcendent truth. That is to say, even though this is a sensitive subject and we want to handle it the right way with respect and honor to every human being, we want to show that to you as well and make it possible for you to see there is another side to the coin. If that is acceptable to you, then I encourage you to continue to listen. Let's first look at when there is true gender dysphoria. Someone really does look in the mirror and see a man's body that they simply don't identify with, or perhaps a woman's body that they just don't identify with. Their internal sense of self doesn't match with their biological sex. This is a real experience, just like a soldier returning home from the war zone and facing themselves in that mirror, that inner soul. They cannot reconcile themselves with herself or himself with the actions they were involved with on the battlefront. How many have not heard stories like that? Returning to our subject, in 1980, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Health Disorders of American Psychiatric Association called this disassociation with one's gender transsexualism and listed it as a mental disorder. That entry was later replaced by what psychiatrists call gender identity disorder. Then in 2013, it was later modified to a more gender dysphoria, which is simply discomfort with the gender a person is living in. So how many transgender people are there in actual fact? Well, if you look at the statistics scientifically and all the data in an academic rigorous environment, there aren't many. right about around about the 0.5% of the population. But if you're in that category, the small size of co-sympathizers doesn't matter, because you face rejection, laughter, ridicule, as I've mentioned. It's very real to you, just like that soldier I have personally spoken to. Broken, confused, suffering, can't reconcile with themselves, hate themselves. And what you are feeling is real. And I'm speaking directly to you if you're a transgender person. You didn't choose your dysphoria. And if you're a believer, want to know more about the subject, listen, they didn't choose that dysphoria. If you were to tell me that you were trans, listen, I would not even bat an eye. I would not even look away, embarrassed or ashamed or not knowing what to do. What I want to explore is how you are going to live in the light of that dysphoria, in a way that honors Jesus Christ, or possibly the way you're living dishonors Christ. This is the big question we have, not whether you're trans or not. What are you doing with it? Because while there is an acceptance of you as a person and a very real challenge that you face, that does not mean there is a blanket carte blanche affirmation of the various ways you can respond to your orientation or dysphoria in a negative, downward spiraling, extreme and harmful behavior that often is the case because of depression, rejection, and all the rest that I mentioned. Now here's what Jesus wants for all of us. He wants to heal anything and everything that is broken. And we all are sexually broken in one way or another. And we all need Christ brought to bear on that brokenness that we've all faced at some time in our life. There's not one human being that hasn't faced kinds of challenges that show the sin that fell upon mankind in the Garden of Eden. Remember in our first session, we showed the Creator, God the Father, created you in His image. We're all spiritually disabled through the sin that came into the world and disrupted God's perfect, beautiful creation that we read in the book of Genesis. We all are spiritually disabled and have aspects of our lives that are not as they were meant to be. Just take the massive percentage of people who identified with the Me Too movement. You remember that. On the Me Too website, they posted through research that 1 in 4 women have experienced rape or attempted rape during their lifetime. Can you believe that figure? According to several national US surveys, they were disrespected. They were taken advantage of. On and on. The Me Too movement brought that to light. In fact, without going into all the details, I also experienced this at the age of 14 years old. And fortunately, got out of the situation very rapidly. I ran away, basically, without any damage or further scene coming about. As we have seen so far, you have true just gender dysphoria. You didn't choose it. You're not culpable for your condition. Having dysphoria is not a moral issue. While gender dysphoria is a real psychological condition that causes someone to think and feel like a different sex, it doesn't mean that you are a different sex. Our brokenness isn't immoral. Sin isn't immoral and to be avoided and run away from and buried, the proverbial ostrich with the head in the sand and pretend it's not there. Sin is real. It happens to everyone. But it's how we deal with it. That's what's important at the end of the day. So there are moral choices. Brokenness isn't immoral, but there are moral choices that flow out of how we respond to our brokenness as in the other areas of our life as well. How do we respond? Because remember, the way you respond will affect those around you. It's not just about you. Christ's call on your life. And I don't care whether you're gender, transgender, or whatever gender you associate with. The issue right now we're talking about is that Christ has a call on your life to get that help you need to manage your gender dysphoria in the light of a relationship with Jesus Christ, and to surround yourself with people who will serve you and help you live in accordance with your actual gender. You don't have to be alone, or one of those stats that I mentioned earlier. 69% of transgender people have experienced homelessness. 70% almost. That's just crazy. Why? Because they were thrown out, rejected, got rid of, even from families. In a healthy psychology, there is unity between your biological sex and your sense of self. Jesus wants to bring you back into that unity with yourself. Not commanding, demanding, rejecting, slapping, bashing. That's not the way of Jesus Christ. The way of Jesus Christ, like the woman at the well we read of in the Bible. Jesus didn't reject her because she came to the well at midday. Now, you don't do that in the Middle East. And it's kind of, she had already had 5 husbands, and the one she was living with, she wasn't even married to. She had a real rough life, and Jesus didn't point out her sin to get her down. No, Jesus' departure point was healing, help, giving her a freedom and a choice and a possibility for a life. Even if there never is that full union of yourself within yourself, this side of heaven, the goal is for you to live in submission to how God made you, and how He made you is hardwired into your biology, not your psyche. He initially created you to relate to Him as only your gender can. There is no mixture or combination thereof. Humanity's manifestation of who and what God created to have relationship with Him is within the uniqueness of either male or female, finding its full and complete expression in the union of these two, building life, stewarding resources, and causing God's creation to flourish. It's not about just making babies, as wonderful as that is, but it's together, male and female, bringing onto earth, as Jesus prayed in the Gospel of Matthew, bring onto earth as it is in heaven. Here's that commissioning scripture that I mentioned to you in our first session, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, a seminal passage at the birth of humanity. Verse 26, and God said, let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. And I'm adding some emphasis, as you can hear. They will reign over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock. Can you see the stewarding aspects coming in there? All the wild animals, the scripture goes on to say, on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. Verse 27, so God created human beings in His own image. In the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. Remember, He's the creator, not you. You see that word there, reign, that I mentioned to you? The tribe of women and the tribe of men together in unity reign. That is to say, they cause the world to increase, to flourish, to grow. They steward properly the resources of the earth and of one another. It's our responsibility, not God's. So, there's a big life out there. So, when you become confused about who you are, you also become confused about what you should be doing. It has an effect. And that domino effect goes through all of your life. And eventually confusion sets in and disorder. So when it comes to living out a trans life, in terms of dressing opposite to your biological sex or medically transitioning to the opposite of your biological sex, I want to say to you, Jesus would say to you, please don't do that. Rather, He would say, He would invite you on the journey towards living in acceptance of your biological sex. And it would be a journey, not a sprint, to discover who you really are and learn and grow to love that person. Statistics show as well that many of the trans folk in discussions and in therapies that really hated their bodies. disliked and rejected themselves over and over again. It's the same story. That's why they want to change. The call of Christ is orientated towards living out the divine image that God created you to be. Sexed bodies are part of that image. Transitioning would be moving you further away from who you really are, not bringing you closer. And so as you come in closer to your Creator, amazing miracle begins to happen. You begin to see differently. And the way you used to see is not going to be the way you then see as you draw closer to the one who created you. Now, the Bible tells us, how can the piece of clay say to the potter, you're not to create me like that, I want to be like this or by that or like that. Paul tells us, no. The creator, the potter, in this particular analogy, puts forth his hand and molds and shapes and makes that pot of clay the way he wants it to be. And that's what God has done with you and I. If you come to Christ and enter into Christian community, the goal is to return you to God's creational intent, to help you find congruence of gender identity with biological sex, to accept your sex body as part of your God-given identity. Now I know this is going to take a journey. This is not a quick sprint. It's a journey of discovery. And it's a journey you're called to begin, and you can begin it. Take the first step, the initial step. Why don't you just draw aside to some place and say, God, would you help me find myself? Now, you don't have to even be a transgender person who's struggling with these issues just to pray that prayer. You could be anybody. Male, female, trans, I don't care who you are or where you are. All of us need to get to that point where we stop and say, God, help me find myself. Dr. Preston Sprinkle, president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender, tells the story of a young man named Alan. And it's an interesting story to me because Alan grew up as a pastor's kid, but couldn't wait to leave the church after he graduated high school. And isn't that the story of many of us? For as long as he could remember, Alan had an unchosen desire to dress, to act, to behave like a woman. He had no one to talk to. Isn't that a shame? No one to guide him. And seeing the church's attitude towards the LGBTQ population, people made him feel even more isolated and ashamed. Even within his own family, he was constantly shamed, which is the story we've heard of already. He also grew tired of the hypocrisy within the church, talking up grace but not putting it into practice. So after high school, Alan left the church, but he couldn't get away from Christians. One day, a Christian friend asked him that he wanted to hear Alan's story. So Alan told him everything. His desire to be a woman, his sexual attraction to men, his failure in trying to follow his own convictions about sexual ethics and things, and just failed over and over again. And Alan expected, of course, to be typically condemned. And to his surprise, he was loved. Instead of shaming and condemning that he expected, he was told that despite his past and present desires, God didn't hate him. And he was loved by God and by others. Those simple words pierced his very soul. And Alan gave his life to Jesus Christ, all because he had the courage to share his story with a Christian friend who received him graciously. Reflecting on it, here's what Alan said. If I had never learned about pure, undistilled grace, I would have transitioned to a female and left the church. The thing that brought me back into accepting a biblical masculinity, not a cultural masculinity with big noise, big trucks, big muscles, a biblical masculinity, was not a poignantly laid out exegetical argument against transsexuality, nor a fire and brimstone kind of diatribe against homosexuality, which we've often hear, but a man who gave me the space to speak about my desires openly and safely, and let me know that he and God loved me nevertheless. That's the way forward for every human alienated from God through whatever reason. It doesn't have to be this issue. It could be all kinds of other issues, addictions, all kinds of different kinds of addictions, and the shame that goes with this. God is not interested in pointing out sin. Do you think he honestly doesn't know about your sin? Come on. He knows everything. Because his son came to show you a path out of that sin that God knows all about. Out of that internal turmoil and pain, whatever it may be. That pain is real. Whether talking to a returned vet, a man's man, we would say, with PTSD and the shame of his own hate and fear as tears rolled down his cheeks, with the pain of a wife and children who were forced to abandon him out of fear for their own lives, or someone battling with the transgender issue. What is needed is communities of healing. That's what's needed. And if you're a believer, I want to challenge you. Are you part of a healing community? Or are you one that points fingers, laughs, mocks, looks down upon as prejudice? Healing communities that are prepared to put their life where their mouth is. See, love is the point of healing. That's where it starts for anyone, for everyone. No matter whether you're transgender or not. Be part of that healing, not perpetuating further destruction of a life created and planned for. Put simply, we have no right to prevent the work of grace because you are a beneficiary of that fellow believer, servant of God, perhaps a leader. You're a beneficiary of God's grace. Give that grace away freely and help rather than criticizing. Please return back for part 3 of this series that we're doing next week. And our prayer here at New Life is that you would certainly experience love, acceptance, peace and joy, which is God's heart for you. Not us here telling you how you should be changing and hurry upon you about it. No, I think it's more about reaching out and saying, hey, let's walk a journey to wholeness and freedom. And you don't know that freedom until you've actually started the journey. So don't reject it outright. Listen, at least lend your ear to what we're saying. Thank you for joining in. God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you next week.